Imagine a king whose power spanned continents, whose word shaped nations, yet who faced an enemy no army could conquer, his own body. What if I told you the mightiest ruler of his age, King Philip II of Spain, met an end so horrific, so degrading, that it forces us to confront the fragility of even the most absolute power? Prepare to journey into the dark heart of the Escorial Palace in the scorching summer of 1598, where a monarch accustomed to divine right would be reduced to a feast for the lowest creatures, a prisoner in his own decaying flesh. This isn't just a historical account, it's a visceral reminder that even at the pinnacle of human authority, mortality waits, unbiased and unyielding. In the spring of 1598, at 71, King Philip II, ruler of the First Global Empire, began his final, agonizing decline. For decades, he had battled severe gout, a relentless adversary that had twisted his limbs and confined him to a wheelchair by 1591. Yet, his legendary work ethic persisted. He meticulously reviewed state documents, his single-word annotations dictating the fate of thousands across his vast dominion. But by June, a new, more sinister chapter began. Intense fevers brought delirium, and horrifying abscesses erupted on his right knee and hand. These pustules would rupture, drain, and then reform with terrifying intensity. Court physicians, limited by the medical understanding of their time, resorted to ineffective poultices and bloodletting. The infection, however, spread relentlessly. Within weeks, the king was bedridden, only able to move his head and left arm. The man who once commanded armies and navies found himself utterly dependent, his famed Spanish etiquette crumbling as he lay soiled in his own excrement. As July's oppressive heat intensified, so did Philip's suffering. The abscesses multiplied, spreading across his chest, groin, and legs. From these suppurating wounds emanated a putrid stench so overwhelming that even his most devoted attendants struggled to remain in the royal chamber. The smell of rotting flesh permeated the palace, forcing courtiers to press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses. Philip, still lucid, ordered the windows closed, not for his comfort, but to prevent the royal stench from offending those outside. Contemporary accounts describe his body as being covered in festering pustules that constantly burst and refilled with blood and matter, never truly healing. These open sores became grotesque breeding grounds for something far worse. Immobile and in excruciating pain, Philip's sweat-soaked bedding created a horrifyingly fertile environment. In early August, the first lice appeared, quickly multiplying. Witnesses reported that lice swarmed so thickly that attendants couldn't keep his body clean, despite constant efforts. Diego Yepes, Philip's confessor, chillingly wrote that the lice bred within the wounds themselves, emerging from the king's own putrefying flesh. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living hive of parasites, but the lice were merely the beginning. Royal physician Andres Zamurio de Alfaro documented that the king's wounds began to develop putrid and corrupt matter in which many maggots were engendered. These larvae, likely from common flies, found their way into Philip's open lesions, feeding on his decaying tissue. Imagine the horror. A man once revered as semi-divine, now watching as worms writhed beneath his skin and emerged from his wounds. Each day, servants would clean away the maggots, only for new ones to appear the following morning. Philip, fully conscious, found solace in his faith, reportedly remarking, "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me, though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins." By August's end, new horrors emerged. The constant pressure against his immobile body created massive bed sores, particularly on his right hip and lower back. These pressure ulcers, exacerbated by his inability to move and the perpetual dampness, eventually wore through skin, fat, and muscle, exposing bone. Royal chronicler Seedeater described one ulcer on his right hip, so large that it was possible to see into the internal cavity of his body. This nightmarish wound, the size of a fist, developed its own grotesque ecosystem. Fray José de Sigüenza, who documented the king's final days, wrote that from this wound alone, attendants removed material enough to fill 2 silver basins daily. More disturbingly, this cavernous lesion became the primary breeding ground for maggots, which multiplied faster than they could be removed, burrowing deeper when disturbed, literally consuming the king from within. The flies, drawn to the king's open wounds, were not content to lay their eggs only in dead tissue. As Philip's condition deteriorated, they began to infest his mouth, nose, and ears. Unable to brush them away, the once feared monarch could only endure as insects crawled across his face and into his orifices. Some historians believe Philip may have developed myiasis, a condition where fly larvae invade living tissue in multiple sites throughout his body. Compounding this agony was his worsening gout, which made even the slightest touch to his extremities excruciating. Yet his body had to be moved and cleaned, and each attempt to change his position or bedding sent Philip's screams echoing through the palace halls. The monarch, who had once watched impassively as heretics burned, now begged for mercy from his own servants. Throughout this horrific ordeal, Philip's mind remained largely intact. This clarity was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deterioration. He was fully aware of his transformation from sovereign to corpse. The king who had built the magnificent Escorial as a testament to Spanish glory now lay rotting within its walls, conscious of each new indignity. Despite his agony, he maintained remarkable composure regarding spiritual matters, requesting daily mass and the reading of religious texts, his faith unwavering. He even continued to discuss affairs of state and the future of his vast empire with his son and heir, the future Philip III. By early September, new symptoms compounded the king's suffering. Persistent diarrhea and kidney failure caused his legs and abdomen to swell dramatically with edema, stretching his compromised skin to the breaking point and creating new ruptures for infection. Court physician Garcia de Nate documented a high fever and delirium, likely indicating sepsis had set in. In his more lucid moments, Philip repeatedly asked for the same crucifix his father, Emperor Charles V, had held at his death, a symbolic connection to his imperial legacy. The treatments prescribed by royal physicians following humoral theory likely hastened his demise. Caustic substances containing arsenic and mercury were applied to his wounds, burning his tissues. Frequent bloodletting further weakened him. His diet, limited to broths and watered wine, provided inadequate nutrition. The combined effects of infection, parasitic infestation, and misguided medical interventions created a perfect storm for his body's complete collapse. Even the weather conspired against him. The unusually hot summer of 1598, combined with the Escorial stone walls, trapped heat, accelerating the decomposition and breeding cycles of the insects tormenting him. By the second week of September, the end was clearly approaching. Philip, still conscious despite his extreme suffering, called for his children to receive his blessing. His son, the future Philip III, visibly shocked by the transformed figure, reportedly had to leave the room several times, overcome by the sight and smell of his once formidable father reduced to a writhing, infested shell. In a final act of kingly duty, Philip reportedly warned his son about the temporary nature of earthly power, gesturing weakly to his ruined body as evidence. "I have been treated like an old dog," he reportedly told the prince. "Remember this when you wear the crown. On September 13, 1598, Philip requested the final sacraments. During the anointing, observers noted that flies continued to land on the holy oil, drawn by the stench of putrefaction that no amount of incense could mask. It was a macabre tableau, divine grace mingling with mortal corruption. The king's final hours were marked by increasing respiratory distress as fluid filled his lungs. At 5 a.m. on September 13th, after asking for the crucifix to be placed on his chest, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. The monarch who had commanded the wealth of the New World and the might of Europe's greatest army had finally been conquered by the smallest of adversaries. The aftermath, a legacy of decay. The task of preparing the royal corpse was unprecedented. Given the advanced state of decomposition, traditional embalming was nearly impossible. Court records indicate the body was so compromised it began to break apart when moved. Royal embalmers worked quickly, using vast amounts of perfumes and spices to make the remains presentable. Despite their efforts, the body continued to deteriorate rapidly, and the funeral proceedings were abbreviated. The sealed casket hurried to the royal crypt beneath the Escorial. Philip was interred alongside his father and wives, his physical corruption finally hidden from view, if not from history. News of the king's horrific end spread quickly throughout Europe. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip was viewed as a tyrant, accounts of his suffering were met with barely concealed satisfaction, seen as divine retribution. Queen Elizabeth I of England reportedly remarked, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." In Catholic territories, official accounts were sanitized, emphasizing his piety and dignity. Medical historians now believe Philip suffered from a combination of conditions. His long-standing gout likely developed into rheumatoid arthritis, compromising his immune system. This, combined with suspected diabetes, created ideal conditions for multiple infections, including a systemic staphylococcal infection causing his pustules and abscesses. His immobility led to severe pressure ulcers that provided entry points for maggot infestation. What makes Philip's case so notable is how it functioned as a grotesque inversion of his earthly power. The monarch who commanded men to die by the thousands could not command insects to leave his flesh. The king whose word could condemn heretics to fire could not stop his own body from becoming a breeding ground for vermin. As historian William H. Prescott wrote, "No amount of power or wealth could purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortality is subject." Philip's death stands as a powerful memento mori, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, offers no immunity against the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition. His demise represented the ultimate democratic principle. Kings and commoners alike must face the indignity of physical decay. The only difference is that Philip's status ensured his suffering would be meticulously documented and remembered for centuries. The irony of his end was not lost on contemporary observers. Philip had spent decades prosecuting wars to defend Catholic orthodoxy and the divine right of kings, presenting himself as God's chosen instrument. Yet, his final days suggested no divine intervention, no miraculous preservation. Instead, the most Catholic king suffered a death that seemed more like punishment than blessing, abandoned, it appeared, by the very God whose cause he had championed. For the Spanish Empire, Philip's death marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. His son, Philip III, lacked his father's work ethic, and within decades, Spain would lose territories and influence, surrendering its position as Europe's dominant power. Some historians suggest that the horror of witnessing his father's end contributed to the younger Philip's reluctance to fully engage with the burdens of kingship. The Escorial Palace, envisioned as the center of global power and a monument to Spanish greatness, would never again serve as the effective command center of a world empire. Instead, it gradually transformed into what its architecture had always suggested, a magnificent mausoleum. Today, visitors to the Escorial hear sanitized versions of Philip's death, focusing on his piety rather than his physical corruption. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Philip's horrific demise is the way it has shaped our historical imagination. His death serves as a powerful reminder that the distance between the heights of human power and the depths of human vulnerability is not as great as we might wish to believe. The king who ruled half the world discovered in his final days that he could not rule the processes of his own body, a lesson as relevant to modern leaders as it was in the 16th century. For all his territorial conquests and political machinations, Philip II is perhaps most vividly remembered today for the manner of his leaving this world. Not in glory on the battlefield, not in peaceful sleep, but in a protracted nightmare of corruption and consumption. His story reminds us that history's judgment often comes not in how we wield power, but in how we face its inevitable loss. From the greatest monarch of his age to food for worms, not after death, as happens to all, but while still living, still thinking, still feeling every bite. As we conclude this dark journey, we might reflect on the words supposedly found among his private papers after his death. To have been and not to be is not to be at all. For a king obsessed with legacy, there is bitter irony in being remembered not for the empire he built, but for the grotesque spectacle of his disintegration. His death has outlived his achievements in our collective memory, serving as a visceral reminder that power is always temporary, that glory always fades, and that in the end, nature renders all equal, kings and commoners alike, returning to dust, sometimes inch by excruciating inch. Now we want to hear your opinion. After watching this chilling story, what does Philip II's final agony reveal to you about the true nature of power and mortality? Leave your answer in the comments below. If this video kept you hooked from beginning to end, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more fascinating stories like this. Your support is very important to us.